Okay then, cloud gurus, let's see if we can take some of that theory and get it to make sense. But a couple of things up front. This is just a sample app, yeah? So it's not super maintained, and you know what? It's not even always using the latest and greatest on the Kubernetes front. But I've had a look at it just now, and for me, it's good enough for what we're demonstrating. Also, right, this is just a gentle walkthrough. Nobody's expecting you to know what all this stuff is yet. And you know what? I'm not even getting into the weeds of any of it. So don't stress if it feels a bit much. I mean, we've barely started the course. Anyway, here we are at the course's GitHub repo, and this is the sample app. And I tell you what, I'll put the app's architecture over here. And I'll just start at the top and work my way down. So for the load balancer up here, well, we want to look in the WordPress YAML. Now then, this is a declarative config file. We've talked about them earlier, and I tell you what, we are going to see a million of them in the course. Well, it defines a few components of the app. For starters here, this defines the load balancer, and we'll come back to it in a sec. But then we are defining some storage, and then a deployment, the WordPress front end. Anyway, this load balancer up here. Proper detail to come later in the course, okay? But Kubernetes has this resource in the API called a service, capital S, yeah? And it's about network abstraction. And this one here is a type we call load balancer. Now, on cloud platforms like AWS, Azure and Google, it is a thing of beauty. Because when you post this to the API server, Kubernetes is going to go and talk to the load balancer APIs on your cloud and spin you up one of the cloud's load balancers, internet facing and all of that. Brilliant. Well, this one here is saying have it listen on port 80, and then it'll balance across all the pods behind it. Speaking of which, this deployment object down here, this is for the WordPress front end. It's based on this container image here, uses some of these values to talk to the back end, and then apparently it uses some storage as well. Speaking of which, again, up here, we're making a request for some storage, 20 gigs and read-write. But we're not after the detail yet. You get the picture. 3 Kubernetes objects defined. A service object up here, which is going to get us a cloud-based load balancer. That's going to balance across some pods in a deployment object down here. That's 2, which in turn is requesting some storage here. 3. That's our 3 Kubernetes objects. So, each time we get API version and kind like this, we're defining a Kubernetes object. The load balancer service at the top, some storage down here, and then a deployment down here that runs some containers in pods. And that's the front end of the app. Well, what about the back end? For that, we'll open up the MySQL manifest here. And a similar story. A service again, some storage, and a deployment managing some pods and containers. But this time, right, look, the service is not a load balancer one. This one's just for internal cluster traffic on this port. The storage was similar though, I think. Yeah, 20 gigs of read-write. And then the deployment is running MySQL pods. And I think we'll leave it there, like I said at the top, just a gentle stroll, yeah? The point isn't for you to be a Kubernetes expert, not yet, right? We're just getting started. The idea is, though, for you to have a glimpse of how we maybe map some application requirements onto Kubernetes objects. So as we've seen, those objects are declared in YAML files, and then as we'll see later, we feed these YAML files to the API server using the kubectl command, and Kubernetes makes the magic happen. Running app, yeah? Well, you know what, right? With the load balancer on the front end, that magic, like we said, includes spinning up a cloud load balancer. Now, that only works if you're on a cloud that supports it. But you know what? A few simple lines of YAML, and we've got a load balancer. For the deployments, we had a couple of those, right? One for the WordPress front end, and then one for the MySQL back end. And each one was referring to a Docker image that had the required code inside of it. Well, once that YAML reaches the API server, the cluster takes care of spinning up the pods and running those containers. And that's how it works. Describe your app in a Kubernetes YAML file and let Kubernetes do the rest. But it's early days, right? It'll all start to click as we crack on. I hope, though, that this has given you a bit of a flavour, yeah? Well, let's have a quick recap.